appreciate you being here so very much.
Thank you so very much. We just want to say right out the gate that 2 of our panelists, first off, we've planned this event in the past 2 days, as most of you probably know. So it's been the efforts of so many people coming together to help us, and so many people at the last minute deciding that they would speak on our panel. So thank you so much. And 2 of our panelists got out of class late, so they'll be showing up in about 5 or 10 minutes. So we'll just welcome them when they get here.
But this has really been such a collaborative effort, so we just want to say thank you to every person who contributed in even the smallest way possible. It's really great. So I guess we should really just talk about how this all started. All of us had to experience what happened a couple weeks ago with the marathon, a traumatic event that the community really shared. And you know, although there was a lot of fear going around and a lot of people felt scared and expressed that, there was a whole community of people that were feeling fear that maybe weren't really getting visibility, and those were people who may identify as Muslim, as immigrants, because in the wake of things like this, people often want to find someone to blame, right? So right now, people who identify as Muslim are at risk for being discriminated against, for experiencing prejudice, and online, on television, in so many different kinds of social media, you can really see how these forms of discrimination are playing out.
Even if you just think about, like, everyone was watching the news when everything was happening a week ago. Even when you just think about when they found out who the suspects were, the main thing that the media focused on was where they were from, that they were immigrants, and what their religion was. So that's the nature of why we decided to start this initiative to begin with, which is the Don't Meet Her with Hate initiative, which...
Yes. It really was just Twinkle and I kind of having conversations about how we really felt like this was unjust and that we wanted to do something. We wanted to take action. So on a Saturday night, not so long ago, a week ago, in fact, yes, starting at 10 p.m., Twinkle and I painted this banner. Twinkle came up with the idea for the text, and it reads, "Don't meet hurt with hate, love Islam." And we really wanted this banner to be a visual representation of support to Muslim students who might be feeling alienated right now, isolated, might feel like they're being targeted.
So basically, I don't know if anyone's seen this banner. If you've seen this banner on campus, will you just raise your hand? Okay, awesome. It's hung right in the middle of the quad, and what we've been doing all week with the help of so many people who have volunteered, and some of you who are here, is standing out by the banner and asking people to engage in conversation about it. So we've been asking people, usually, you know how things are, you're like, please come sign my banner, like, come here right now. So we're sort of like, do you want to sign our anti-hate campaign? And can you say no to anti-hate? That's so typically we reel people in that way, and then we start to have a conversation about what their experience has been like. Also, feel free to get food, sit down on the floor, sit down at the tables. This is the biggest room we could get at the last minute, so thank you guys for being here. So students on campus, faculty members on campus,
Staff members
on campus, people who are coming to visit the campus during Arts Fest. There was a group of middle schoolers that signed the banner. Everyone's been coming and signing different types of words of support, notes of encouragement, and telling us about what their experience has been like. For example, some of the students have told us that their roommates who are Muslim, that are students on the campus, have felt scared to come out of their dorms since the bombings have happened, because they felt afraid that people in the school and people in their classes will think that they had something to do with it, just because of how the media is portraying Muslims right now. So when they heard about the banner, we found out that it's been a huge source of support for them, and they started to feel like they could feel comfortable on campus and feel like they had some allies. I think that that's an important thing to note, that both Kim and I, we're not Muslim. This is just something that's really important to us as members of the BC community, to stand up for our Muslim friends right now, and our friends who are also not Muslim that are being targeted, foreigners, immigrants, to say, we're all in this together, and we're all here to talk about this together.
So this project is definitely about allyship at the end of the day, and really encouraging people to participate in allyship. So in a first step towards that, we thought that trying to dispel some of the myths and misconceptions about Islam would be a good direction to go. Several students contacted us and said, you know, I don't really know a lot about Islam. I realize that, you know, like I don't know anyone who's Muslim. And if I did know something, maybe that would, you know, prevent discriminatory attitudes and things like that. So we decided, you know, let's get rid of all of the stereotypes that we see in the media and just hear from people who have varied perspectives and who all identify as Muslim.
Exactly. So we've been collecting questions for the past, I think, what, 24 hours or something like that?
Via Facebook, personally. Yeah.
Students, from our professors, everyone's just been amazing in sending us in questions. And that's why we created this panel tonight. So we're here to answer some of the questions. We have 10 questions laid out, and we also want the format of this to be very discussion-based. The panel will talk when they feel like talking about something. Not every panelist has to answer every question. And more than anything, feel free to ask response questions when you hear responses. And
yeah, we want this to be informal in the sense that we really want people to feel comfortable engaging in dialogue. You know, we're in a circle right now because we want this to be a dialogue. I also just want to acknowledge the fact that this is a subject that can be pretty heavy for people. And asking questions is sometimes a scary thing to do. So we really want to make sure that this is a supportive environment and make sure that it's a safe space. We right now are collectively trying to engage in a form of education that can combat injustice, and if we all commit to that collectively, it means that we can also assume good intent, know that we're all working towards the same goal. So please take care of yourselves. If you need to step out of the room, please do so. But also, I hope that you challenge yourselves and really put yourselves out there. So, with that being said, let's introduce our panel. We have a really lovely assortment of people who were so gracious to do this last minute. As we said, we really just pulled this together kind of over a weekend, so they've been really very, very great. So we have Ali Banu Azizi. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry if I butcher anyone's name. He is a Boston College professor in the Department of Political Science. We also have Lisa Tobias. She's a finance director at World Tech. And we have Dana Collins, who is a counseling psychology doctoral student, who very last minute also agreed to be on our panel, and we are so grateful for that. And as we mentioned, we're going to have 2 more people coming. When they arrive, we're going to have them introduce themselves. But panel members, if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about yourselves, we would like to know, just like, again, introduce yourself, give us your professional affiliation, as well as your personal affiliation with Islam. So however you'd like to explain that to the group, we'd appreciate that.
First of all, word of thanks to the organizers. As they pointed out, this was really a spur-of-the-moment attempt on their part. I'm personally delighted and very grateful to them and grateful to all of you who have come here. My name is Ali Banu Azizi, and I've been at Boston College. I was just telling our chaplain for over 40 years, so that's before your time. And I am currently a member of the Political Science Department at Boston College and the director of the program, which is an undergraduate major and minor that is called Islamic Civilization and Society at Boston College. And my personal affiliation, as you put it, you know, it's interesting that in the US we talk about religious preference or religious affiliation. Most of the rest of the world don't think of religion as preference. What is your preference, by the way? So my personal affiliation is that I was born as a Muslim, and I teach the field, and I certainly follow the events in the Muslim world, and a personal interest as well as an academic and professional interest. Yes.
My name is Lisa, illustrated above and here. I was born in Boston City Hospital. I grew up in Dorchester. I went to Boston Latin High School. I went all the way to Cambridge for college and then came back to Boston University for grad school. So my heart is really tacked into the ground here. And I was interviewed by one person right after the bombings. I went to the memorial service the Thursday after. Got on a 5:15 bus to make it there. I had to be there. And they asked why I was there. And my first answer is that I was brokenhearted as a Bostonian that this happened in my city. Also, I am Muslim, and I have been for about 5 years. It was the result of a spiritual journey. I was born into an atheist family, found myself looking for something more, and after reading the Quran and making some wonderful, with some friends, I realized that it was the affiliation, the choice for me. How American. So, yeah, indeed. So I work now at World Teach. We send volunteer teachers overseas from the United States, and in theory we're educating children around the world, but also in fact we are educating the American volunteers that we send to be citizens of the world. And I think the fact that you guys are here now probably demonstrates that you have a bit of that about you. So thank you for coming. I really appreciate it.
Hi everyone, I'm Dana. I don't know that I'll have anything really interesting to say right now, but maybe it'll come later. So I was born in Oakland, California. And from there I went to Spelman College in Atlanta, and then I went to Indiana University for my master's in counseling. I guess that's probably the main personal as far as my relationship with Islam, I was actually raised Catholic. My family is kind of a mix of Catholic and Baptist and ambiguous and Muslim. So there's a lot of different things there. But I reverted to Islam, I think about 5 years ago. And people have asked me a lot of different people have asked me in a lot of different ways why. And I've never been able to pinpoint one thing. It was a combination of a lot of things. But I guess the main thing is that it was something I believed in and identified with, and something that I felt passionate about. So that's why I left them.
So I just want to welcome our speakers for being here. So thank you.
Okay, so we are going to begin with some questions that we received. If you just came in, I'll just remind you that we got them from Facebook, from personally via text, all types of ways. So the first question that we're gonna ask is, why are you Muslim? And Dana, you touched on that a little bit, but.
Okay. Yeah.
And anyone can start.
I believe in it. It could take an hour and a half to tell the story, so I guess the shortest version is, when I was searching for faith, I looked into Christianity and I looked into Islam. And being a Boston liberal, I wanted the widest range of options, and Islam included Muhammad, and basically most other things about Christianity. And so I found it wasn't a contradiction to love both faiths. That's the very short version.
introductions, and feel free to kind of get yourself settled before we ask you to speak. So right now, everyone's just answering about why they are Muslim.
Before we jump back in, just because we do have this little interruption, would you all mind just saying your names and maybe speaking very briefly about your professional affiliation and your personal affiliation with Islam?
Is that directed to us?
Yes,
Oh,
I'm so sorry.
Hold on, I almost have a name. So my name is Nuri Friedlander. My professional affiliation with Islam is an interesting question.
Oh, no, it's just
Your professional affiliation, like
Yeah.
where do you
In
go to
general.
school, and then
So
why there.
Your
I
personal.
have a professional affiliation with Islam also in some sense. So I'm a Muslim chaplain at Harvard University. I'm also a PhD candidate in the study of religion, and I focus on Islamic law and ethics. And I myself am a Muslim. My father converted to Islam from Judaism in the 70s, so I was raised as a Muslim in New York, and then we moved to Cairo, Egypt when I was 15.
Thank you.
I'm Nail. I am, I guess professionally, I'm a third year at Harvard Dental. Previously, I studied history of science at Harvard College, where I focused on Islam and issues of science, especially in early modern, pre-modern period. My affiliation now with Islam is not necessarily working, as a chaplain, but working with a lot of youth groups, working in a number of mosques around the Boston area specifically, as well as around the country. And so I was born a Muslim, but anybody who's born something, you eventually there's always a journey there. I wasn't born with a beard. So just to put it simply. Yeah. He's seen the pictures.
Great, thank you so much. And then just to catch you up, we just started our first question, so you got here just in time, really. And that is, why are you Muslim? So anyone can answer in any order you'd like.
Well, as I was saying before, for me, quite honestly, this was not a choice. I was born into a Muslim family, and quite frankly, I didn't have much of a religious education at all. And it was not until I was really a college student, and then in my professional life, that I became interested in the study of Islam, and have continued. So all that I know is what I think I've acquired pretty much on my own, and I think this has been extraordinarily rewarding. So it's a bit of a different journey from those of you who converted to Islam, but in many ways, a very parallel path.
So why am I a Muslim? It's an interesting way to phrase the question, because you could look at a number of different things to it, right? So what does it mean for me to be a Muslim? Like why am I still a Muslim? Why am I a Muslim? Like, how did I end up being this thing called Muslim? On some level, there's this idea of being born into a faith. I also believe that anyone that chooses to continue doing anything that their parents did, after they're like 11, has done that by choice. So I guess in my own personal journey, I accepted this, or I adopted this as something that was my own. I think primarily and initially because of people that I encountered in my life who really inspired me, and that were people that I said, like, whatever that person is doing, that's what I want to do with my life. Because that person has something, some quality, some way of being that I want. So I think for me that was really the most powerful reason, if you could use the word reason, for me to be a Muslim. Another way to answer why am I a Muslim, kind of simply, is it gives meaning to my life. Being Muslim provides a certain kind of grounding for me, a kind of centering that allows me to go through life with purpose, with direction, and hopefully with a certain kind of conscious awareness that I find meaningful.
I just wanted to add one note, and that is, and I think this may relate to some subsequent discussion that we're going to have, that perhaps it's not correct to think of one's identity only in religious terms. You know, we are many things, and the religious identity is only one among many of those things. Now, with some of us, those of you particularly who are in the ministry of Islam, of course that takes on a professional dimension, but for the rest of us, being a Muslim is only one of several different identities, and I think that should never be forgotten. Knowing who we are, and by others knowing and understanding what we're about.
And I think, you know, to build on that, if I was to talk about, you know, the ministerial role that I have, it's much more about why am I a social worker than why am I a Muslim.
Just like to remind people that you can ask follow-up questions if you'd like. If something comes up you want to know more about, feel free to raise your hand and we'll call on you. We're going to keep asking questions, but again, if you have a question, just raise your hand, okay?
So the next question that we got that was submitted out of sort of the second of 10 questions, which is kind of a big question. So if you want to share an answer, that's fine, or if one person wants to take it. How was Islam started?
I just said one thing, I think, to hear from some of the ladies.
I was actually just reflecting on the first question, because it's a really big question, and it's one to start off with. But I'd like to quickly touch on the first question of why am I a Muslim, especially somebody I was born in the state of Washington and grew up in Oklahoma, in California, and other places, and I think when you ask the question, why am I a Muslim, as opposed to why am I not something else, it reminds me of how different it is actually when you ask the question of why would somebody continue upon their path after the age of 11 as a Muslim, especially in an environment in which that identity is constantly questioned, deliberated, negotiated with others in the classroom. So you have memories, and I have memories of being a first grader sitting outside while everybody was making like Christmas cards, and me and my friend who was a Jehovah's Witness, we were sitting outside of the classroom, and so in this Methodist school that we were attending, and so it was an identity that you had to kind of decide, and maybe at some point as a first grader you wrote to your teacher to say, I'm doing this because I don't celebrate Christmas. But but at a later age, that's maybe the way you thought about it at the age of 11, but maybe at the age of 18 you said, I may not celebrate Christmas, but I definitely celebrate Jesus, because Jesus was a prophet of Islam. and so in that respect, you know, why am I a Muslim is, I think, relates a lot to relates a lot to that journey. It's a journey of constant questioning, which is very different, I think, from a lot of other identities. Although it's shared with a lot of other religious minorities. Why am I a Mormon? You know, it's a constant question which has lots of different answers at different stages.
So you asked also the question about how Islam started. So I guess fundamentally from a Muslim perspective, Islam means many things, but it's seen as a way of life. So in that sense, a Muslim would say that it started with the birth or the creation of Adam, and was passed to all the prophets, and that the current incarnation of the Quran came down to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in, I believe, the 7th century. And so, you know, the idea of when it started, I mean, as a religious person, you might ask, when did God start? And it's a very fundamental theological question. An important point in that is that we don't believe that it was a creation of Muhammad. We don't believe it was his own writing. We believe he was inspired by God, but that it was there all along. I don't know if others have.
Yeah, so I think kind of around the time that maybe you can think of its beginning, the civilization that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was living in was, there was a lot of kind of violence and disarray and people not following, kind of, not being very moral, not following a lot of rules. And, you know, that angered God, and God wanted to have the way of correcting that, so he began sending the messages down to the Prophet, peace be upon him. And so we Muslims believe that Muhammad did not come up with the Quran, or the content of the Quran. He received it through God. And there's several reasons why we believe that it wasn't that the Quran was not from Muhammad, peace be upon him. One is that Muhammad was illiterate. He couldn't read and write. And the Quran, if you've ever listened to it, is very kind of intricate. It rhymes. It sounds very nice. So it would be difficult for a person who didn't have a lot of formal education to come up with it. Also within the Quran is, I'm not going to get all the details of this right, but there are explanations of a lot of things that people in 7th century Saudi Arabia wouldn't know. Like it talks about a baby being implanted in a mother's womb, or clouds forming. So there is a lot of evidence that would suggest that a normal human being did not create the Quran, did not create Islam.
Just to add a little bit onto what was said earlier, because it may sound a little, I mean, the answer that we heard just before us, but about Islam starting with Adam must have sounded somewhat odd to us. Like, well, it started with Muhammad, didn't it? That's what it says on Wikipedia. So I better go change it after the session. So what does that mean? And this is a really interesting question, because when you hear the word Muslim, for somebody who doesn't know Arabic, the word Muslim may sound the same as the word Hindu, or being Jewish, or being Christian. But the word Muslim is not actually a noun. It's not really an entity. It's actually an action. It's a verb. So, like being a Christian, when I say I'm a Christian, there's an affiliation with Christ. When I say I'm a Hindu, technically it's an affiliation with a geographical region. So prior to the arrival of the Muslims in India, they were called. They actually weren't called Hindus. That was actually what anybody who was called from India. So I'm technically from India originally, so I am one of the Hunud, technically, in the Arabic language. Whereas when you talk about being a Muslim, it's an action. And so when the Quran talks about previous prophets, it'll refer to Abraham as a Muslim. And this gets to something that's really ingrained in the Islamic tradition, which is not to get caught up in the names of things. that it comes really down to a person's state of being. It comes down to an action that the way they actually live their life, their relationship to God. And so that's where something to just keep in mind. Just so just wanted to clarify that, since that, I mean, it's an important conceptual point.
It means believer, more or less. Is that right?
Yeah, literally, it
Sure.
does. Yeah, it does mean a believer in a more general sense, in a very specific sense of what it means. It means one who submits, like one who submits themselves to God, and what that means is submitting the way they might lead their life, not in a blind sense that I'm just going to listen to anything that I hear anybody say, but in a way to acknowledge that I need guidance, and it's not all about me.
If I could follow up on that, I think, first of all, Islam came into being under the full lights of history. There is nothing mysterious about how Islam became a religion. And as I think my colleagues pointed out, Muhammad did not think of himself as a founder of a new religion. He thought of himself as a reformer. That is, the fact that those who were already believers in the other monotheistic religions, from his point of view, had digressed from the right path. He came to correct those misinterpretations or distortions. Now, that implies, really more than implies, it affirms the fact that Islam accepts the other religions, monotheistic religions, and regards them with full respect and belief. I thought I would give you a couple of passages from the Quran to bring this to life and to exemplify what I'm saying. This is now, as you know, in Islam, the principal sacred thing is the Quran, roughly occupying the same status in Islam as Jesus occupies in Christianity. That is, Christianity is based on the acceptance of Jesus' mission as the Son of God, the Spirit in flesh. In the Quran, the equivalent sacred idea is the Quran itself, in Islam, that is. Now, and these are some, and the Quran is taken to be literally the words of God as revealed to Muhammad. That, by the way, creates certain problems, because in Christianity, for example, the sacred text, the Bible, is a number of accounts that were provided by the disciples around Jesus. And there are indeed, certain disagreements among the Gospels. But in the Quran, there is a sense that the entire thing was revealed to Muhammad as God's words. So there is much less room for interpretation, if you will, within the Quran as there is in the Bible, at least according to traditional views of Islam. So here are a couple of quotes from the Quran that emphasize this acceptance of the previous messages. So the Quran says, now this is God speaking, we sent Jesus, the son of Mary, confirming the Torah that had come before him. We sent the gospel in which guidance and light and confirmation of the Torah had come before him, a guidance and admonition to those who fear God. So there is no mistake that the Torah and the Bible are accepted as previous dispensations by God. Then it goes on, the next verse. He established for you the same, meaning now God established for you, the same religion as that which he established for Noah, that which we have sent to you as inspiration from Abraham, Moses, and Jesus, namely that you should remain steadfast in religion and make no divisions within it. Now these are really remarkable passages in the clarity with which they affirm the righteousness of the previous dispensations, and from the Islamic point of view, certain digressions, certain distortions that may have occurred. So the Prophet of Islam was, unlike Jesus, was an ordinary man. There were no claims of divinity for the Prophet. But what was remarkable about him was the fact that he was trusted by God to receive God's words and dispensations. That may be the difference, I think, between Islam and Christianity. In the sacredness of the word, in the case of Islam, and the sacredness of the prophet of Christianity, Jesus, as the Son of God.
So I'd like to add to that, because I think those are some really powerful answers to this question of how did Islam start, both in this sense of timelessness and the sense of what this message of Islam came as a continuation of these previous revelations. I also like to give you a little historically bound kind of story, like what happened when Islam started. So 7th century Arabia, you have this city called Mecca, which is a hub for pilgrimage because there's this structure there called the Kaaba, which is this cube structure which Muslims believe and the people of that time believe was built by Abraham. And it had become a center for pilgrimage for a number of polytheistic and idol-worshipping religions of the area who would come every year, and everyone had their own idols set up. And Muhammad ﷺ was a man who grew up in a society. He was an orphan, and he had been married to a woman who was a couple decades older than him, who was a wealthy merchant in the city, and who he had worked for previously. And while he was very much part of the society and engaged in worldly endeavors, he also had this kind of spiritual draw. So he would go to a cave outside of Mecca for days at a time, and he would fast and sit in contemplation and in meditation. And one day he was doing this, and a voice came to him, and the voice said, read, or recite. And astonished, he said, I'm not one who recites. And the voice said again, recite. And he said, I'm not one who recites. And the voice said, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم. Recite in the name of your Lord who created the human being from a clot. Recite, your Lord is the most generous. And the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ became overwhelmed and stricken with terror because there was this majesty and this overwhelming power in this command. And he ran down from the mountain back to Mecca. And I remember growing up hearing this story, and it was just like, he was in this cave outside the city, he ran back home. And then when I went to Mecca and went to the cave, it's like an hour-long hike up this like desert cliff, and it's like a half-hour drive to get there from Mecca. So this is like, he's overcome by fear and fright, and he runs home, and he throws himself into his wife's arms, and he says, embrace me, cover me up, and tells her what's just happened to him. and says he's like deathly afraid that he's losing his mind. And she says, you're not the kind of person that God would forsake. There must be something real about this. And she had a cousin who was a monk, because at the time there were these polytheistic religions, but there were also Jewish and Christian communities. So they went to visit this monk to tell him what had happened and to ask his advice. And he said, indeed, what you speak of is what's been prophesized. And I wish that I could see your community emerge. So that's kind of a historically bound little narrative about how Islam started. And then, so his wife was the first Muslim. After that, his nephew embraced Islam, who was still a child. And slowly, it started to spread. First within his family and his close relations and other people in this tribe in Mecca. And then there's this long, wonderful story that follows.
Thank you
I
so
think
much.
someone
Very,
in the
very
back
comprehensive.
had
Yeah.
a question.
Oh,
Or maybe it's past.
when you were talking about what the word Muslim actually means, and that is sort of an action, it sort of made me think that there can't be anything such as a non-practicing Muslim, the way someone might be a non-practicing Jew or maybe a non-practicing, they grew up that way, but since it's a verb or a way of living your life, you can't really be a non-practicing.
What does practicing
Maybe
mean?
linguistically.
Well, you were saying
what does
the way-
practicing mean? Like, I just wanted to know so I can answer the question.
Well, I guess what I just took from what you were saying about living your life according to what Islam teaches. So you can't sort of not do those things and also be a Muslim if it's a verb. Or what I took from what you said.
Yeah.
Do those things.
Which is not to say that there aren't people who feel that that's what they are. And it's not for any other Muslim to say if somebody is or is not a Muslim also, I think. And you were talking about you weren't born with a beard. So there's people who are born into Muslim families who identify as Muslim but might not be living the full practice. And a lot of them, I think my husband was one of these, went through a moment almost, we would call this a born again in the Christian context, where they just felt the presence of God in their life and started more firmly on that path. But it's not to say that they weren't Muslim before, just perhaps they weren't, life is a journey from the beginning to the end, and yeah, so I think that's a wonderful concept because I should be holding to that idea. Maybe I'm not a Muslim if I don't practice well, but at the same time, culturally speaking, of course there are, I think.
Does anyone have any other questions before we move on to the next? I think the next one's important, but I just wanted to make sure.
Just to quickly add, just to give you also just a takeaway definition, that you're right in thinking that the word Muslim is an action, so you'd expect people to be acting. But in Islam, as in other traditions, we believe that all action begins in the heart, and some actions sometimes don't get past the heart. And so somebody can be in prostration inside their heart and may not be praying yet, but so somebody can be considered a Muslim. It's just like you have some people who do regular handwriting. You have calligraphers; they all do writing, but some just do it awesomely.
Thank you for that.
Niall's a calligrapher.
Not awesome.
I'm going to ask the next question that was submitted, and that is, people often think that the Quran is extremely violent. How would you respond to that?
Which people?
Boxers. No.
They think lots of stuff.
We can contextualize this question a little bit by just thinking about how the media recently has associated a lot of acts of terror with Islam and saying that it comes from the Quran.
And similarly, we got another question that kind of is related to this. Someone asked, when people tell me that, it's in the Quran, it's violent, they are violent people, how should I respond to that? Someone personally asked us that. So also maybe if you could respond,
having in mind people who maybe want to act as allies?
I'd actually like to, I think it's a natural thing for Muslims to duck and cover from this question and say Islam is a religion of peace and just not talk about it anymore. In fact, the Quran is a book that addresses all of the universe, and there is loads of violence in the universe. And human beings, as we know, can be quite violent creatures. And fundamentally, the Quran addresses human behavior, and sometimes it takes violence to end worse violence. And I think an example of this, to put into context, and I'm sure they'll have much better religious examples, but most Americans understand the concept of World War II as a just war on the American side in Europe. When you're faced with a horrific oppression, terrible things that people do to each other, you sometimes need to stand for what is right and you need to fight for it. And I think, there are verses in the Quran that say, do not back down from this. When you are called to fight, you should fight. In that context, it delineates many rules of war and what you are not allowed to do when you're doing the standing and fighting. For example, preemptive war is not something you can do. For example, killing civilians is not something you can do. There are rules against cutting trees in a war. And so it takes this human tendency and harnesses the behavior that God didn't create anything without a purpose. And yeah, so I think that's the way I see violence in Islam. You guys feel free to correct me if I'm saying it, if I'm mistaken in any way.
No, I think that was a very it's a wonderful way of responding to the question, and I fully agree with you. If I may sort of backtrack a little bit and make this point, that again, I think the point of reference for most of you is Christianity and Judaism. Those are two religions with which we're perhaps better familiar. Now, there is no question that Islam got into worldly affairs, if you will, political affairs, more so than Christianity and Judaism. Moses never saw the promised land, and Jesus had no interest in worldly affairs of this nature. But in the case of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, after he had spread the word, preached the word of Islam, the episode that you described took place in 610, and for the next 23 years, he preached this new revelation. He was invited to go to another city, which came to be known as the city of the Prophet, about 200 miles or so from Mecca. And there he became not only the spiritual leader of the community of believers, their prophet, but also the temporal, the political leader of that community. And in that capacity, of course, he had to manage the affairs of the community of Medina, this new city, which was to be the shining example of an Islamic city on the hill, if you will. And then, in that capacity, he had to declare war when the Muslim community was attacked. So in the Quran, there are obviously passages that speak to these exigencies of political life that you do not find in the Bible, or at least to the same extent. So in that sense, there is, in Islam, acknowledgement, indeed preaching of violence under certain conditions, the so-called jihad, which has different meanings, but one is clearly fighting against the infidels. So this is what gives Islam this, if you will, violent or warlike, or shall we say, realistic, this worldly orientation, which we don't find in the Gospels. But the context is very important.
So I think an interesting point to make is that it's not just our friends at Fox News that make claims that Islam or that the Quran is a text that inspires violence. And when we talk about violence, also, we're not just talking about like violence in a generic sense. We're talking about a certain kind of indiscriminate violence. We're talking about a certain kind of violence in which it seems no one is safe, in which the killing of civilians or anyone identified as the enemy is permitted. There are also a lot of people who call themselves Muslims who say that this is precisely what the Quran is calling them to do. And I think it's important to acknowledge that our friends at Fox News share something with these extremist Muslims in the way they view the world and the way they approach textual interpretation. So that may be a powerful thing to say to people who make this claim that the Quran is a violent text, that it takes a very particular mindset to read it as a violent text, and that there are millions upon millions of Muslims throughout the world that read this same text with all of the passages which speak about acts and instances of violence as a text that calls them to build community and to live in harmony with those around them and to reach out to others when they're in need. And I think it's also very important that while the Quran is the main source of the Islamic religion, is not the only one. And so along with the Quran, there's this huge wealth, this huge body of material, which are the hadith, which are the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And out of these two bodies of revelation, there's all sorts of tradition of jurisprudence, of theology, of ethics, of arts, of culture. All of these have emerged. And if we take one sentence from the Quran and divorce it from all of that, which is also Islam, it may be easy to say, oh, this is a violent religion. But if we place that into context, both historical context, that this religion was revealed at a time when the Muslims were being oppressed, and the Muslims lived for 13 years in Mecca, being horribly oppressed by the dominant population there without raising a hand in defense. And the verses that you find in the Quran commanding Muslims to fight are verses that are addressed to a people that were oppressed, that refused to fight back until God said you have to. So if you take these verses out of that historical context and out of the larger theological and ethical context that is the religion of Islam, then maybe it's easy to say that this is a violent religion. If you put it into that context, it makes it a very difficult argument to make unless you're reading the text with the blinders on of political aspirations. I think it's also really important to note that the people who suffer the most at the hands of indiscriminately violent Muslims are other Muslims. The day of or the day before the bombing at the Boston Marathon, over 50 people in Iraq died in car bombings at the hands of Muslims who thought that they were doing something good by killing all these other Muslims indiscriminately. So I think it's also important to see that in this larger context as well.
If I may just add, because this obviously is the critical issue in all of our discussions and in the times in which we live, just a couple of comments. That, as you correctly pointed out, the vast majority of Muslims, let's say in the past century, who lost their lives. They lost it in battles and in wars with other Muslims, roughly about 2 million or so. Now, at the present time, there are indeed those extremists within the Islamic tradition who do give that interpretation and do promote that violent interpretation. There's no denying of that. They do take it upon themselves, or some of them don't, of course, need a very good example, to have the authority to declare, to pronounce, make pronouncements that in their judgments are based in the tradition, in the Quran, and so on. There's no denying of that. So there is unquestionably a brand of Islam that is extremist, and it has followers around the world. We have to recognize that. And it's very difficult to make peace with those groups. It has proven very difficult, because they are true believers, indeed, in violence against the infidels, against those who in their judgments have inflicted pain on Muslims historically and contemporaneously. So there is that. But to think of Islam as a violent religion compared to other religions is clearly an unsustainable and extraordinary difficult to take such a position. If we again look at the past century, roughly 100 million people died in the European and Western world context. Of these, as I mentioned, 2 million were Muslims who were killed by other Muslims, by the way. So, and much of that violence had nothing to do with Islam. One might say it didn't have much to do with Christianity either, but those who perpetrated that violence were Christians, or in some cases they were Jews. But one would not go from there to a theological argument that therefore there is something violent about Christianity. That's, I think, the point that we need to emphasize. And let me just say that at the present time, there are 1.3 or 3.5 billion people who are Muslims. Roughly 1 out of every 5 human beings on the surface of the earth is a Muslim. And needless to say, the overwhelming majority of Muslims are ordinary people who pursue their lives in many different ways and have absolutely no connection to violence. So we are dealing with groups within the Islamic community who, for whatever reason, and I think those reasons are understandable, not justified, but understandable, given to violence.
Thought I'd just add to the discussion by just giving one quick example, because again, I think so many of us, as we talk about religion, our own or others, we often it's sometimes nice to get an example from the source text, just to give an example of how somebody who has this crazy interpretation, which would be crazy to me, crazy to you, could take it and run with it. So there's a one of the verses in the Quran that is in a surah, a chapter of the Quran that's revealed in a time that's addressing a time of war and saying, do not take them from the referring in that context to Christians or Jews or others as your protectors or your friends. Now, somebody who has a very low level of religious literacy is approaching that verse and is reading into it as much as whatever they wanted to read it to begin with. Meanwhile, that verse there has a very specific context, has a very specific group of people that they're speaking about. Because if they were speaking about all Christians, then when the Christian delegation came to the city of the Prophet and began praying in the mosque of the Prophet, and at first some of the companions objected, and he said, no, let them pray, they're worshiping God too. right? So it's obvious that for somebody that's looking at the tradition in a broader sense, would understand what verses are being referred to. But when we live in a time where, you know, everybody has their Bible or everybody has their Quran, the danger is when of what that holds for interpretive possibilities. But the point that was just made, which I think is really important, which Professor Beno Azizi just said, and just wanted to underscore it because I think it's a really important point, is when we turn something that is more political in nature and we give it a real theological stance. So when we say something like Islamic terrorists, so what is Islamic about terrorists? Or when we call somebody who is you know, committing what they think is a jihad, and we call them jihadi. In a way, we've almost dignified them with a term that has a very specific definition, and anybody who falls outside of the definition is causing violence and is not on a jihad. Right? Somebody who's cutting down, you know, has no disregard for the environment in their military pursuit, has killed a woman or a child. The Prophet himself said that's not a war. That's something else. And so it's very important to make that distinction and to see how we apply terms, whether when we're referring to people who commit violence and they happen to be Muslim as well, versus are those terms, how are they applied to other religions?
I think it's interesting that when I was talking about it, there's a certain amount of reclamation that we can do of terminology. Like we hear this thing about like extremist Muslims or like a radical Muslim. And if you're not locking your neck to oil rigs in protest of the XL pipeline, there's nothing radical about you, right? Like that's the kind of radical Muslim I'm looking for. If you're not out there doing something about gun violence in Dorchester, that's not radical, right? Like if you want, like let's have some radical Islam and like hit the streets and do something about poverty, do something about violence in our communities, do something about the environment. Otherwise, we're all just wishy-washy.
Wow, thank you for
Thank
that.
you guys very much. We just want to be mindful of time and like recognize that you've brought up so much important information. I hope that this is helpful to everyone that has come, that you've gotten something that you didn't know before. So we just wanted to open up for questions about maybe what was said or things that weren't said that you're still wondering. I know that some people sent us questions about headscarves, some people sent us questions about partying, some people sent us questions about dating and how that works. So whatever questions have come up for you, we just really invite this to be a conversation now.
Can I get a quick poll? How many of you have a Muslim friend?
Probably why you're here.
I'm not affiliated with the university, but I have a lot of friends that are darker skinned, and even they feel like they've been kind of targeted, and they won't wear backpacks anymore. they have briefcases now, and so I mean it's been kind of a shock for me to hear that. Even, so,
Given the fact that these guys were white.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they were from Caucasia.
I know.
In my community, in the mosque in Cambridge, the women, like I have had 0.0% of people give me any problem, and my black and brown friends have largely had problems. It's but it just shows that hatred is not intelligent in any religion or culture. It's just not.
I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on the depiction of the events that happened around the marathon bombing and continuing through that week. I remember watching, I was watching CNN unfortunately, and within 5 seconds they changed it to terrorists bombing. I mean, of course it was an act of terror. Yes, it did incite terror in people. However, there's a connotation, especially in our day and age with the word terrorist. So I'm just really interested in seeing from your religious context, or like from your critical lens, as to what you can say about what happened in the marathon bombings and the depiction of these two young men, and the creation of American exceptionalism in that too, as well.
You said the word critical, which I think is really good. I think it's always important to look at the media and reporting with kind of a critical eye. Otherwise, it's very easy to be misled. And I think it's good to think about why are they pointing out these facts versus other facts. I was reading an article last week, and it started off with ethnic Chechen suspect is being held in custody, and I'm thinking, why would you start the article out? Well, I know why, but it's that kind of thing. You need to be asking what is being reported, how it's being reported, and I feel like I'm kind of going off on a rant now, and I'm not answering your question. But I guess that's my response is to, I'm not suggesting that you be skeptical of everything, but ask why.
I think the Boston media did better than the national media, big time, which I'm really grateful for. They didn't do a perfect job, but, and this might be on a pettier level, we're, as Muslims, we're not supposed to gossip, and when I see the news, it just looks like a festival of gossip, and so my job as a Muslim is sometimes to turn it off and get to know real people. And I've been fundamentally impressed by all of the real people that I've seen, because I wasn't Muslim after September 11th, and I remember how I felt, and I wasn't remotely as kind and understanding as the people on the street have been to me. So I think everybody has marked a long way. The media has also done better, which is not so good, but I think you're asking the question and it sort of answers itself.
I would also just really briefly say that Glenn Greenwald is a great commentator on exactly this question. He writes a column in The Guardian, and he's written a few on the way the word terrorist means Muslim in our common usage today. So I would recommend all of his articles. He's had really good coverage on these incidents and on things in the past. And he's a lawyer, so he brings that to it. Constitutional lawyer.
I wanted to share a conversation I had with a patient of mine yesterday, and it was very interesting because she missed her appointment, so she was in apologetic mode. But as she was saying all the crazy things that have happened over the past 2 weeks to her specifically, then she started talk about the Boston bombing. And she's an elderly lady, who's lived in Boston her whole life. Maybe I think of Irish descent, and so she tells me, what's happening? What happened at the Boston bombing? What's happening to our community? And I'm saying I don't know. Things are going crazy. And she says, what happened to our young men? What's going and that's when I think when you watch the media, it separates people. It makes you feel like you're not in the same community. And here was a lady in a way was projecting her vision of that community that we're trying to establish here and perfect here, and she had that, and I think that's something that that we all in this room and beyond have to really seek to work toward is that conception of the community, because when the media's framing of things, it creates these categories and makes exceptions seem like rules. And I think that the more that we can recognize that and then express that, just as that lady did, was a real internal expression of somebody that didn't buy into that. Here I was her Muslim dentist, right? and she's, you know, sharing that with me. So I think that things have changed a lot in that respect. It's very different from what it was like just several years ago.
I think, may I just follow on this too? You know, we should, of course, own up to some of our problems. In the sense that clearly there are young people here in the US and elsewhere who are drawn to these extremist ideologies. And the examples of the two brothers would be one. But that is clearly a recognizable problem and concern, and it should be. The question, which I think has been raised, is to what degree do Islamic centers and mosques in the US are supportive of these extremist ideologies? Their preachers, the ways in which they might encourage this sort of thing. And by all that we know, and there was a wonderful op-ed piece about this just a few days ago. In fact, the Imam at the Boston Islamic Center, what is his name? Suhaib. He was one of the two authors. He referred to what goes on in his own mosque, and he reported on many, many other Islamic centers, clearly stating and offering evidence that there is not that kind of encouragement and radicalism in the various Islamic organizations and centers in the US. Now, elsewhere in the world, of course there are. There are indeed mosques in which this kind of ideology may be encouraged. There are religious figures, religious leaders who may encourage this kind of extremist ideology. But not insofar as we know in the US. We don't have, if you will, an Islamic establishment or a series of Islamic mosques around the country that would give encouragement and support and direction to this kind of violence. I think that's very important for all of us to know. That is not, to close our eyes to the presence of extremism. That does exist, as it does in other religions as well. But to what degree are the religious authorities are supportive of these kinds of ideas? And apparently that is not taking place in the US, and I think that's important.
One of the sisters at the Cambridge Hospital that went quite a bit just asked herself, where did we go wrong with these boys? It was sort of the same thing, just how could we not have reached them? Just as Muslims, they were members of our community, and that they became so alienated as to do such a thing is, we tried to talk about what we could offer to young people feeling left out, because it's, I still really don't understand how it happens.
There was a really interesting incident that happened with, I think it was the older brother, and you may have read about it. So at the Friday prayers, right? Just as you have the Sabbath and Sunday prayers, Muslims pray on Fridays, and so one of the Friday services at the Cambridge Mosque, in the service, the name Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was quoted, and the older brother got up to exclaim that it was impermissible to cite somebody who was not a Muslim, who was a disbeliever, and he was actually eventually asked to leave the mosque. But just think about that incident, and think about somebody again who has in some ways missed the whole point of being Muslim. What we said earlier, that Muslim is being an action. It's going for what is the meaning of a person. Being able to see wisdom in things that are maybe named something else. But here's somebody who obviously missed that point, wholly so and tragically.
Wow, thank you so much. I just want to, like,
agreed to be here and who have been very thoughtful in their responses to these questions. Thank you also to all of you who have attended this event. I think it's very near and dear to both of our hearts. So thank you. And I hope that this is a spark for conversation. I hope this is where the conversation begins and that each of you guys take this to other people in your life, to your friends, to your family, to your religious leaders, and start having conversations.
Absolutely. And, you know, we passed out these, Julie was helping us pass out these myths and misconceptions sheets about Islam for your friends that couldn't make it. We know actually about 60 people that wanted to come to this event tonight couldn't, and they asked us if we could videotape it because they wanted to learn as well. So this is just a resource sheet for people who want to continue this conversation with others. And also, the Peace Islands Institute donated food to our event. So for anyone who would like to stay around and continue this discussion, please get some dinner and hang out and talk to our panelists and talk to anyone about this. Thank you.
Yeah.